Lecture 1. May 12, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, the title under which this course of lectures has been announced is somewhat amphibious. Philosophical Elements of a Theory of Society. Point 1. Some of you will have racked your brains and asked, so is that philosophy or sociology? And only those who have been exposed to my corrupting influence for some time will have recalled that I do not make the distinction between these disciplines as separate trades so strictly. In keeping with what Mr. Horkheimer said yesterday in his introductory seminar course, philosophy is anything but a trade. To what led me to this formulation is not the twofold title of my professorship, however, but something far more serious. Namely the fact that I am asked time and again, and now especially by students of sociology, so you speak of a theory of society, what actually is that? Do you have such a theory? If you have it, why don't you just come out with it? And if you don't, why are you talking about it? So these constantly recurring questions led me to put it that way. I hope I will be able to answer these questions, at least to the extent that I can elaborate to you some of what I imagine I know about a theory of society, but at the same time, I must explain to you the flaw of such a thoroughgoing theory of society, for it is always better to admit to, and hopefully explain well, an existing lack than to conceal it through some ideology. But it goes without saying that such a matter as the nature of a theory of society, insofar as it includes a reflection on theory itself, is at once something substantially philosophical. For while the standard practices of scholarship can be used to form theories, an examination of the possibility and nature of theory, and also a specific theory, is considered the domain of philosophy. In this context, let me remind all of you, but especially the sociology students among you, that the work of Max Weber, whose incredible wealth of material and empirical familiarity with the facts of society no one could deny, contains a special volume of so-called methodological writings, for it is a matter of taste whether the reader wishes to call these texts philosophy or sociology. The task I have set myself is twofold. On the one hand, I would like to give you a notion of what a theory of society actually is, what it can be, and what it might look like. But, on the other hand, in keeping with both the brevity of such a lecture and my own way of approaching such things, I would also like to use a number of models to develop for you the elements, as announced, of such a theory of society itself. These two things, incidentally, are very difficult to keep apart. One of the dimensions of these lectures that will require a little relearning on your part is that I am not willing to make a rigid separation of method and contact, indeed, that I will even do all I can to unsettle the thinking habits that insist on such a separation. In other words, I will develop the methodological questions from the factual ones and, conversely, reflect on the factual questions themselves with methodological considerations, for example the structure of dialectical thought. That is also one reason why I will not begin by presenting a definition of a theory of society and its elements, as some of you might expect, because I believe that an understanding of such a theory can be attained only by addressing the philosophically epistemological questions on the one hand and the factual structural questions of society itself on the other. To begin with then, I am referring to the concept of a theory of society, and I am merely saying this so that you can get your bearings before being offered an elaborated concept of a theory of society, roughly as is familiar to you without having to engage in great philosophical deliberations, namely as an explanation or interpretation of phenomena, as opposed to their mere collection and subsequent more or less systematic presentation. So, if I say first of all that a theory is understood here as a body of more or less coherent contexts of ideas about society, that will be enough for now. I must add at once, however, that this deliberately very general definition of what such a theory is will form the framework for something that, at least epistemologically, is a central intention of what I have begun here. The distinction between a genuine theory of society and mere containers or collections of data. To the extent that we will deal with methodological considerations and questions about the concept of a theory of society, that will certainly be one of the most important tasks that is revealed to us by the current situation of scientific theory. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I had told you that some speak time and again, especially in the context of the shortcomings of positivism, of both the necessity and the deficiency of a theory of society, but without being truly able to offer such a theory with a clear conscience. And indeed, no one does what people used to do in the days when the great so-called fathers of sociology, Saint Simon, Comte, Spencer, Marx too, and finally perhaps even Durkheim, though one could question that, presented their conceptions of society. I would argue, however, that the reason for this can be found not only in the advance of a positivist scientific mindset, though this scientific mindset essentially views all theory with suspicion and considers it a necessary evil. The earlier positivists such as Comte and Saint Simon, who can be considered positivists in a broader sense, referred to what we call theory in a substantive sense with other, somewhat derogatory, terms. Metaphysics, for example, was a frequent choice. I think that the crisis of theoretical thought in sociology, and it is certainly no exaggeration to speak of such a crisis. Those of you who were at the Heidelberg Congress 6 and heard the reactions of the panel members to the lecture by my friend Marcuse 7 will have seen very clearly from the start how widespread the hatred towards emphatic theory is in academically established, official sociology. How widespread a genuine hatred of any theory that is more than the abbreviation of the facts it encompasses this crisis depends not only on the scientific mindset but ultimately also on the matter itself. That is to say, the increasing difficulty of truly grasping contemporary society with theoretical concepts, on the one hand, and on the other hand, certain changes in the consciousness of thinkers and researchers that make it increasingly difficult for them to adopt any theoretical stance at all. In relation to these changes in the object and in the subject's level of awareness, however, the slogans of positivism very often strike me as mere rationalizations to conceal something that lies beneath and bears much greater weight. In the history of positivist thought in sociology and positivist research in sociology, moreover, almost every sociologist who does more than simply conduct some narrow investigations is immediately suspected by his successors of being a crazed theorist or, to use the term from the Index Verborum Prohibitorum of the positivists, a metaphysician. If you read Durkheim's Rules 9 for example, you will find that even Comte, who God knows offered no shortage of invective towards metaphysics and metaphysical thought, is denounced there as a metaphysician, for the telling reason that he worked with categories related to the totality of historical movement in society, such as progress or an internally cohesive humanity, both of which are unacceptable for a nominalism as extreme as Durkheim's tenor. To give you a different example of the same general phenomenon, it is no exaggeration to count Max Weber among the positivists, at least in his substantial intention of his work, not only because he argued that irrational actors should heroically take the disenchantment of the world upon themselves, but also in the method of his work, which from the outset describes the concepts it uses as mere auxiliary tools that have no independence from whatever facts, but whose purpose is simply to measure the facts in order to structure them, and these can then, as he says quite openly, be discarded if necessary, as prefigured in Weber's famous theory of ideal types. 11 as an aside, as this year happens to be the centenary of Max Weber's birth, I would like to connect, as far as I can, without giving an outright lecture on Max Weber, these problems to Weber's work and repeatedly open up perspectives on his over, not only because of its wealth of material, but also because the problems we are dealing with are addressed in many of his texts at a very high level and with very great clarity and rigor. It is therefore not a coincidence that I keep returning to Weber, but a specific intention. Although I told you that, in certain basic tendencies, Weber can be considered an exponent of positivism, and thus of an actually anti-theoretical stance. And although I will add to this by noting that there is nothing by Weber that truly resembles a theory of society, that he did try out sociologies dealing with specific topics, such as the great sociology of religion, 12 or finally individual sociologies, such as the outline on the sociology of music, 13 or that he examined certain interconnections between categories but never produced anything like a theory of society as a whole, it is still unmistakable that Weber's output, going by the work that is generally viewed as sociology, as science today, by no means seems so theoretic. Let me say this at once. The reason I am placing such value on this problem that recurs insistently throughout the history of sociology, namely that one school of thought considers another too theoretical or metaphysical, is that this eternal recurrence seems to suggest that, in this science especially, which adopted the call to focus on the facts as its mission statement with an almost hysterical fearfulness, that this science is constantly urged by its own object to go beyond mere facticity, and that this, in the eyes of every critic, is then easily attached like a stain to the sociologist thus criticized, which, if I am not mistaken, shows precisely that a science of society cannot actually be envisioned except through theoretical thought. Let me at least tell you how profound Max Weber's relationship to theory is despite this, shall we say, anti-theoretical or anti-systematic mindset. Here I am not thinking of his methodology, which is a comparatively superficial aspect, for arch-positivists such as Lundberg 14 or Stauffer 15 have authored extensive methodological writings, or Lazarsfeld 16, but would rather say that the matter itself contains a theoretical aspect. I will remind you of just one of his central concepts, namely that of understanding, 17, which is his attempt to understand social behavior from within rather than applying concepts of identity to it from the outside, as it were, on the basis of particular similarities or consistencies, and through this understanding from within to find a way of identifying something substantive about the interrelatedness of social actions among all individuals, instead of overlooking from the start the ways they come together and merely providing the data. It is precisely this concept of understanding, which he incidentally adopted from the Southwest German school, especially from Heinrich Rickert's 18 concept of the ideographic. 19, namely the method in the humanities that focuses on the description and understanding of the individual. This concept of understanding as an attempt to grasp from within is actually profoundly opposed to the positivist impulse, and it is no coincidence that a passage by Kant that can be considered one of the foundational texts of the positivist scientific mindset, namely the Amphibole chapter from the Critique of Pure Reason, 20, includes a fierce invective against a theory of his immediate predecessor Leibniz that criticizes understanding the matter itself from within, as is inherent in the concept of rationalism, in the harshest terms. As an aside, to draw your attention directly to what makes this structure special in Weber's work, What we find is that, in agreement with Durkheim, he now does not want to view this understanding as a psychological understanding of separate individuals, but, rather, sets himself the task of understanding social behavior from within as social behavior, not in terms of the subjective motivations of the individuals. He does this for a very profound and legitimate reason. He knows that, insofar as we act socially, insofar as we move within the context of society, we generally act not as psychological beings but actually as functionaries, to use a term that is fashionable today, one might say as role-bearers within the social context, and the key role carried by the concept of the rational, of rationality in Weber's sociology, can be understood precisely from this perspective. Rationality plays such a decisive part in Weber's work because rationality, as the organ of adjustment to reality, or as contemporary psychoanalysis calls it, testing reality, is removed from psychology, from the unconscious of the respective individuals, but can simultaneously be understood on the basis of its objective mechanism, namely the mechanism of calculation. That means one can grasp from within, if you will, what makes a person act socially. To accept or turn down a position, for example, to make some decisions as a businessman or a politician, this can essentially be understood using the same rationale that also governs the respective person's own behavior. And this fact, which is initially indisputable, was what led Weber to make rationality the key category of sociology, not that he thought everything happens rationally in society, on the contrary. Completely irrational categories such as that of social prestige, to name only one example, play an extremely important part in Weber's sociology, but one can say that he saw this as the point of access where social behavior can be understood from within, where something like a coincidence, if you will, can be brought about between the observing scientific subject and the object, namely the socially acting person or persons. If one wanted to develop a little further this thought, and which is naturally not formulated explicitly by Max Weber, one could say that the incredible emphasis he places on the concept of rationality suggests something almost like the concept of objective spirit, which, of the many things that positivist science finds offensive about Hegel's philosophy, is probably one of the most offensive. Because Weber makes this concept of rationality so central, however, he arrives at something that stands in extreme contrast precisely to the notion of a non-theoretical sociology which assesses individual phenomena only by their ideotype. And I can only repeat here, in the context of the problems we are seeking to investigate, what I once had occasion to say in Heidelberg, namely that with Weber, as with most theorists of any significance, those parts which do not appear in Baedeker, 21, by which I mean the things that they did not say programmatically about their own intentions, are more important than what they did say. And if I can give you some reading advice in this context, because I do think that many or some of you will read texts such as Economy and Society or the Sociology of Religion in connection with these lectures, it is to concentrate far more on what Weber does, on the investigations he carries out and their own structures, than on what he says about it in methodological reflections. He is a thinker, and I would call this a strong argument in his favor, whose analyses possess far greater theoretical force than his purported epistemology. So if you look at Weber, this a theoretical and neutral thinker who was sworn to presenting what is the case, who wanted to deal only with what is the case and not let in any thoughts about what should be the case, you will find that a major tendency running through society, throughout history, is constructed in his work, namely the one he posits with his own central category of rationality. Because he retains rationality as the ultimate authority for the sake of the objective validity of mathematics, because of its irresistibility, it is strange how mathematics creeps into the unmathematical Weber's thinking at every turn. Something that would merit examination, he views the overall tendency of society as a tendency of progressive rationalization and ever advancing development in the calculation of all socially relevant actions in the sense of a probability calculation, not only as a heightening of rational and mathematical procedures that are available to society. For Weber, this point, namely the development of the procedures in themselves, was only of secondary interest. What was most important was that, in his view, according to his theory, which he supports with extremely historical material, calculation according to the model of such a probability affects more and more sectors of society, that society itself is increasingly becoming rationally controllable and controlled. The famous thesis of the disenchantment of the world from the lecture Science as a Profession and a Vocation 22 is quite simply an expression of this tendency, a tendency that, according to Weber, is inherent, is immanent. In the principle of rationality itself, this rationality must spread to ever greater sectors of life. This, he argues, goes hand in hand with the change in the mechanisms of power, without which he cannot imagine society, to rational mechanisms of power, that is, mechanisms of power that are dealt with by a social group which, as he envisages it, is ultimately no more than an executive body of this rationality itself, namely bureaucracy, and the thesis of the inexorable bureaucratization du monde, which really constitutes the true historico-philosophical aspect of Weber's sociology, and in which it sometimes almost approaches certain Spenglerian perspectives of becoming frozen in late Caesarist periods. 23 is derived from this equation of bureaucracy and rationality. So you see how Weber's sociology, simply because of certain observations it makes on the basis of the weight that certain categories bear in it, without any deliberate allocation of systematic precedence by the author, is ultimately forced into a theoretical construction of society. And I think that if there is an argument for the science of society actually to view theory not as a deficiency, but as something that lies in its own nature, this can perhaps be shown most convincingly contrario, namely in the fact that a way of thinking such as Weber's, which viewed itself very much as a specialized science, and thus stood in the starkest contrast to the notion of a comprehensive, overarching historical, philosophical construction, became a form of theory in spite of itself, both out of its own momentum and because of the oppositions affected by it. But this goes further. It goes without saying that a way of thinking like Weber's was highly ill-disposed towards a concept such as dialectic, something that is deeply rooted in philosophical speculation and cannot be separated from philosophical, specifically critical philosophical, reflection. And this hostility was expressed in Weber's scientific mindset, after all, in his polemical stance towards materialist dialectic, a position that, as most of you probably know, is the real motive for Weber spending such a massive amount of time and work on his sociology of religion, and why he plunged even into the most obscure exotic materials, in order to attack one of the centerpieces of Marxist dialectic, namely the principle that the so-called spiritual superstructure is dependent on the economic substructure. Now, it is a most notable fact that, although one does not encounter a positive use of the word dialectic anywhere in Weber's over, its own dialectical elements are extremely evident. Various things were said about this at the Heidelberg Sociology Congress, for example in Ms. Gerish's presentation, 24. I will name only two such dialectical elements. Firstly, the tendency of charismatic authority. 25. That is, forms of rule that rest on the genuinely or supposedly supernatural, exceptional vocation of a leader, such as the political rule of Muhammad in Arabia, to change over time into traditional rule, to be inherited and thus also to produce firm, fixed, objectified, concrete forms of rule, and ultimately even a bureaucracy. To understand this properly, you must know that Weber's method consists in setting such ideal types charismatic authority, traditional authority and rational authority, for example apart from one another through very exact, somewhat legalistic definitions, and then his plan is simply to observe whether some social phenomena he is investigating correspond to the one or the other type, how near or how far from it, how much they deviate from it, without assigning these types any meaning, let alone movement of their own. But, by examining not only such phenomena as the charismatic type of authority I just used to illustrate this but also their development, he is ultimately forced not only to see them to a certain extent as something autonomous that exhibits tendencies of movement in itself, insight into such imminent tendencies of movement in a phenomenon. Even such an insight is already an element of theory, for such a tendency of movement is not a fact one can objectively determine but, in addition, he is even forced to concede that such phenomena change substantially and in a very particular way, and with them their ideal type. So one could say that a historical structure is produced between the type of charismatic authority and the type of traditional authority, and thus that he teaches something like an overarching structure of social movement, and beyond this such a structure in the form of a movement in oppositions. Thus he concedes, working from within the material itself, something like a recognition of dialectical necessities or tendencies that is actually irreconcilable with Weber's sociological approach. Or a similar dialectical phenomenon in his work is that rational bureaucracy, which is meant to be part of the rational, transparent and fundamentally democratic form of rule, which I already touched on earlier as Weber's central thesis, becomes firmly established and inevitably turns into anti-democratic and irrational rule. As an aside, this is a theoretical insight with which the supposedly so theoretical Weber very accurately predicted developments in large sectors of society directly after his time. One of the strangest things today is that, if one reads something like Weber's invectives against Leninist Bolshevism from the last years of his life, 26, one sees that he prophesied with incredible precision, based purely on the concept of rationally bureaucratic rule, that hardening of democracy towards the people on whose behalf it claims to act, which came to terrible fruition in the later history of Bolshevik Russia, as we all know today. Here we find something like Weber's final legacy, an unconscious legacy of old cyclical theories of society, something of this bourgeois conviction that where democracy fulfills its own concept most perfectly, it will inevitably regress, with a sort of demonic necessity, to roll, blind roll. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us end with this as a first anticipatory illustration of how theoretical elements compulsively assert themselves within an anti-theoretical way of thinking. I will speak to you about the next conclusions to be drawn from this in the lecture on Thursday. Lecture 2. May 14, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, in the previous session, I showed you that a thinker, a sociologist, who can be considered a positivist in the sense that he rejects any autonomy of the concept from the facts encompassed by the concept, is nonetheless forced in spite of himself and precisely because of the material, the facts, the data in which he immerses himself, to incorporate theoretical elements into his work far beyond what his own epistemology would lead one to expect. In this context, I reminded you both that he constructs a large, continuous social tendency, and that there are dialectical elements in his work. And the example I cited to illustrate this was the reversal of charismatic authority into traditionalist authority and the transformation of rational and democratic administration, bureaucracy, into a blind, opaque, irrational rule. My reason for addressing these things was not that I intend to give you a lecture on Max Weber. My concern is for you to see things in their correct proportions from the start, by which I mean that you should understand such evidence, though it is always relevant to the content too, as contributions to the general theoretical problems, or the problem of the theory of society we are dealing with here. I simply wish, at least to a certain extent, to elaborate on these problems for you with a constant eye on Max Weber's work. The conclusion to be drawn from what we covered in the previous session is that even such essentially anti-theoretical or theoretical thought and research as that of Weber, at least in terms of his intentions, I will remind you of just one principle, that of the ideal type necessarily either turns into theorizing or cannot dispense with theory. And a very simple conclusion I would draw from this is that one should not accept this shift into theory as a form of necessary evil that cannot be avoided, but, rather, that one becomes aware of and theoretically formulates this connection between even extremely material-based work and theory. I just told you in this context that, with Weber, this move towards a theory formation resulted precisely from the pressure, the weight of the facts he had to deal with. And this provides an indication I would like to make use of immediately for the things we must fundamentally consider in these lectures. Namely, an indication that the form of theory whose concept I wish to elaborate for you here is not a concept of free-floating, a priori theory. Rather, the kind of theorizing I mean really depends on the facts in question, so, to exaggerate somewhat, one does not come closer to theory in general by moving away from the facts, by isolating some particular characteristics of the facts, forming theories from them and neglecting the rest, with the notion of theory I have in mind. It is precisely the immersion in the concretions that allows us to move beyond the merely fact of one must devote oneself to the individual materials so thoroughly as to reveal more than simply the blind, conceptless material. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you will not expect me already to carry out this program, which is really an epistemological program, in the elements of a theory of society that I hope to present to you. But I do at least wish to indicate the direction of these considerations and to draw your attention to a difference that should be noted at this point compared to the usual and widespread concept of theory. For as long as prevailing scientific thought, including the field of sociology, engages in forming theories, it is simply obeying the logic of classification. That is, theory consists merely in the ordering of materials, the establishment of logical classes, and the possible conclusions to be drawn therefrom. In other words, then, to the extent that theory is an evidence, it lies at a distance from the factual material, which leads to that somewhat unfruitful dualism between a blind material on the one hand and relatively empty concepts on the other, which means that theory, instead of leaping out of the material itself, really becomes, and I will show you this in detail, a shell for the facts encompassed by it. So the opposition to the prevailing formation of theories in the social sciences in which I find myself is not, as some of you will perhaps think, that of a boundless speculation which overrides the actual materials. For if there is a concept of theory to be found that lies beyond that unfruitful dualism, it can only be one that disregards the usual rigid antithesis of fact and concept, one I will mention only in passing that this marks the very nerve center of dialectic. Those of you whose interests are primarily philosophical will have noticed that anyway, and for the others I would not offer any more than that in this present context. The fact that even so-called positivist research, if carried out seriously, cannot avoid forming theories has naturally been observed by the positivists. It is not my discovery, ladies and gentlemen, and one can even say, generally speaking, that the willingness to concede this in social science research becomes all the greater, the more those people truly surrender to their research, the more they saturate themselves with facts. I would almost say that those who are generally most hostile to theory are the epistemologists, the people who are, in a sense, the most theoretical and abstract, and who do not allow the experience of their objects to lead them towards theory. An example of such an extreme, to name only one, is the American sociologist Lundberg, who probably exhibits the most severe anti-theoretical stance. You should familiarize yourself with his philosophy to get a true idea of this extreme. For naturally one can only assess these matters if one has first-hand knowledge of them, as opposed to simply listening to the preaching opinion of an academic teacher, which obviously has a tendency to harden into a form of authoritarian judgment, whereas I mean the opposite. So I will not only be grateful to you, but actually ask you to examine closely and study the very works whose positions stand in extreme opposition to the position I am developing, all the more because in these lectures, if I am to fulfill my own theoretical program, I cannot do much more than point you towards such works. But if we take those positivist sociologists who are not as radical as Lundberg, and who are well disposed towards theory, one will generally find that they are paying lip service rather than truly recognizing the weight of theory. They do say that one cannot dispense with theory. They observe that, for example, an empirical study that is not based on some undetermined, theoretically articulated expectation on a certain anticipation of facts yet to be confirmed, generally has few prospects of finding anything fruitful or productive. Thus, like it or not, they feel forced to speak of theory and grant it some validity in its own right. For example, by imposing certain conditions on it, the way one might impose them on a disreputable social or professional group, namely that such a theory must regularly report to the fact-finding police, as it were, and point out at every conceivable opportunity that it is only a theory, for heaven's sake, not something already confirmed or even confirmable by the facts. In the language of positivism, this is known as scientific cleanliness. I do not entirely understand this demand, because I think that the difference between something that is genuinely an idea and a blind fact should really be obvious even without such assertions. What we are dealing with is actually the aspect I have already touched on in the name of the autonomy of theoretical elements. At this point, the social scientific argumentation of positivism is, I feel, at best highly inconsistent. For on the one hand, the necessity of forming theories as opposed to pure fact-finding is conceded, but, on the other hand, the development of theoretical reflections is really only tolerated as a formulation of hypotheses that can then be fulfilled by finding the facts. To put it dialectically, then and even the positivists sometimes find themselves in a dialectic. Something is supposedly necessary because one cannot do without it, but simultaneously superfluous because, according to this view, once the hypothesis is fulfilled, once it proves true or is refuted, it can be discarded. So in such a view of things, the autonomy of theory as an expression of something in society that is not limited to the ascertainment of individual facts is reversed again. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not a natural scientist, nor do I presume to act as if I were. It does seem to me, however, as if the actual terminus ad quem in the natural sciences, that is, the ultimate goal of scientific work, is precisely the formation of theories, the summarizing explanation of the individual observable facts, and that, in general, scientific experiments are only carried out from the perspective of forming theories. No experiment, no ascertainment of any pure existent fact takes place for its own sake. In positivist, statistically oriented social science, which prides itself so greatly on operating more on following mathematical, scientific rules, the exact opposite is the case. Here it is really mere fact finding that takes precedence, and, from this perspective, the construction of theories itself seems to be a mere useless ingredient that is essentially superfluous, or at least a somewhat disreputable matter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that things happen in this way is obviously no coincidence, but, rather, points to the heterogeneous character of the subject areas in so-called nature and so-called society. That is to say, it expresses the fact that natural science generally works as far as possible with elements that have no properties of their own, that are not already preformed, not already objectively qualified, and that, the more it can reduce phenomena to such propertyless smallest units or elements, which can in turn be integrated into a seamless theoretical summary, the greater is its sense of triumph. In the social domain, of course, which is defined qualitatively to an incredible degree, where qualitative differences are virtually the decisive aspect, this is possible only to a very limited extent, to the extent, for example, that strictly statistical surveys whose elements are fundamentally equated with one another at random can even be carried out. And it has transpired that this is indeed possible in this specific domain, simply due to how reliable the predictions of opinion polls are, for reasons that we can perhaps discuss little more later on. But naturally it cannot be said that in the domain of hierarchically structured society, where the behavior of these elements is not a last object of observation but, rather, something eminently predetermined by the overall context, there can be a reduction like the one that is possible in the natural sciences. Consequently, it is equally unfeasible to bring together the elements thus subsumed and classified similarly with the uniform classificatory theory, which would ultimately mean functional equations, the way one can in natural science. That is why it so readily occurs precisely where the social sciences follow the model of natural science, that they really produce only something like a parody of the natural scientific method, namely ascertaining and presenting facts, which in natural science leads to theoretical conclusions, to formulas, to some more or less final conceptual definitions, whereas the statement and arrangement, if at all, of ascertained facts so often remains the same. If you pick up the Journal of Sociology, for example, and take a general look at the short abstracts that tend to follow each report on whatever empirical investigation, you will find that there are really only classifications of facts, perhaps only in the form of charts, without any of the theoretical conclusions being drawn that are characteristic and central for the genuinely scientific method. Even so, empirical sociology is naturally far too cunning and self-reflecting to avoid an awareness of this element that can be termed a theoretical in a deeper sense. The answer it usually provides is that sociology is such a young science, and, because of its youth, it is not yet able to construct larger theories in the manner possible in the exact natural sciences. I must say that, to me, this explanation, which one encounters time and again, at congresses too, one constantly hears people talking about the youthfulness of sociology. Such explanations are simple nonsense. Somewhat reminiscent of a lady of advanced age, I am thinking of an example from Frank Wedekind, who declares that she was extremely attractive in her youth, And this supposed youth is a spurious claim. If one starts with Kant, for sociology is a good 150 years old, and I would actually say, if one traces it back to St. Simon, 5 it is roughly 200 years old. Now, I think it is a somewhat crude analogy, but an acceptable one, if one imagines what happened in the roughly 200 years between the discoveries of Copernicus and the development of Newtonian physics. That would be around 200 years, perhaps a little more. I don't recall the exact dates what happened in the natural sciences, then whatever has ensued in the way of social theory in the meantime, at least in the framework of the established, institutionalized social sciences, can really be considered quite meager. And, despite its advanced age, sociology does not show the slightest inclination to approach the ideal of a genuine theory of society, one that would illuminate its workings. On the contrary, if one looks at the history of sociology, it is more fitting to speak of it moving away from the formation of theories than towards it. If I can remind you of what I said last time, for example the fact that for Durkheim, Kant's statements about the development of society as a whole already seemed like metaphysics, then I'm sure you will understand that. And Lundberg would undoubtedly consider the principle of the collective spirit's objectivity, which Durkheim espoused, no less of a metaphysical prejudice than Kant's idea was in Durkheim's eyes. Hence the direction of development within this established science is not at all towards the theory that people promise, but rather the opposite. So the reason for this problem, as I have already hinted, is not the mere temporal factor that the time is not yet right, but rather something category L. The anti-theoretical trait lies in the restriction of sociology to pure empiricism. And sociological empiricism, as I learned in my disputes with Mr. Silberman 6, is at its most sensitive when one reminds it that the purpose of sociology is not fact-finding, not the mere collection of opaque data, but rather a concept of theory that reveals something substantive. I am deliberately putting it so vaguely about society. I remember, and I'm telling you this because I would like especially to try and explain the relationship between theory and empirical research as closely as possible. With reference to the approach of empirical sociology, the dispute with a young man, as it happens, very talented assistant on a project at the Institute for Social Research whom I had given certain they were definitely hypotheses for a particular study, and already at that point, in this respect he was highly characteristic of the mindset that is really displayed by sociological empiricism as such. He considered this formulation of hypotheses something questionable and said, well, if one approaches the facts with something like a hypothesis, then this hypothesis is really always on the verge of becoming a form of prejudice. And then one can no longer devote oneself purely to the facts at all. Now, I do not actually mean to dispute the claim of this young sociologist, who is probably not so young anymore, that this is possible. Those of you who have read the piece Opinion Delusion Society from my Intervention 7 will find a fairly detailed elaboration of the argument that, because of its inherent weight, the anticipatory unfulfilled, not factually posited opinion, for metapsychological, objective reasons, I would say, has a tendency to establish itself, to harden, to become objectified and resist correction, and certainly this much is true about that attitude. It is a necessary part of social knowledge, especially theoretical social knowledge, to remain open, to examine itself and improve itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I am well aware that this is easier to formulate in a general way, to set up as a norm, than actually to execute. I have no illusions about this. But I would at least say that a decent scholar, by which I mean a scholar, or a researcher, one should almost say, who takes the truth seriously will consciously and emphatically incorporate the possibility of such self-reflection as one of the most important aspects of their work. But I do think that for there to be anything resembling examination or reflection, there must first be something to examine or which can be subjected to such reflection. So, if one begins simply with examining theoretical views before there are actually any to examine, it is quite certain that no theory will be formulated at all. Let me give you an example of this too from practical social science work. When I had to take over as head of the Community Study Aid in Darmstadt, that would have been 12 years ago, or maybe more, I asked one of the American directors what he and his group actually intended to find out with this study, what they actually wanted to know, what the point of the study actually was, and I asked him, in English, what do you want to know or what do you want to find out? And the respective American colleague, a very friendly and affable man, replied, we want to know just everything, to which I responded, if you want to know everything there is to know about this city, Darmstadt, then you won't know anything. You'll suffocate in such a conceptless material that nothing will be visible at all. When I later began to look at the material, I actually encountered things such as a thorough statistical report on the weather in Darmstadt for every day over the duration of the study. I will not even deny the possibility of finding some form of correlation between some socially relevant trends, for example the number of children produced, and the weather, but for that, one first needs to have the idea of doing that in the first place, which a strict empiricist would probably forbid as an impermissible preemption of the future, so that would not be possible either. In other words, then, and I would already like to draw a conclusion from this today, I have to proceed fairly quickly in these lectures, as we will miss such an inordinate number of sessions this semester. 9. So we might travel across country a little at times, which I ask you to forgive, ladies and gentlemen, namely that in sociology, theory is not simply something that results from the facts automatically as long as one follows the rules, but that there is a sort of leap between theory formation, between an insight into socially relevant factors and the gathering of facts, that there is not a straightforward and reliable continuum between the fact and the theory, but that, to a certain extent, these two areas, as closely as they are obviously and necessarily connected, cannot be imagined in such a way that the path leads from the one to the other without the addition of a further element. And I would say that, if one is to develop a genuine authority for sociology and social contexts, one must, on the one hand, always be aware that one cannot simply move from the concept of society to the facts, as George put it, simply make butter out of the Milky Way tin, but also that, on the other hand, it is equally impossible to arrive at a theory by proceeding from a mere arrangement and gathering of facts and merely placing these in a vaguely logically stringent context. So I think that the crux of the question of fruitful sociological work lies in how clearly one is aware of this necessary and inevitable qualitative leap and, to continue this metaphor, whether one succeeds in leaping or makes this leap unconsciously, and thus incorrectly, in such a way that it fails. In part, the reason for this is simply a matter of scientific history, namely that what we group together under the name of sociology or social science today, and to a considerable extent also political science, is not an internally consistent area of knowledge with a consistent categorical structure of the same kind as in most of the traditional, the so-called classical sciences, but simply a more or less unconnected and unconsidered agglomeration of very different things, such as philosophical reflection on society and its purpose, institutional and historical analysis of social facts, and finally what are more strictly considered research techniques on the model of so-called market research. And I do not think that the future of sociology and sociological theory formation lies in attempting to knock this agglomerate into shape by adapting it to some consistent categories and making a unity of it, a unity that corresponds neither to its category nor to the matter itself. Rather, to the extent that there is any unity, it can be determined only by determining precisely these qualitative differences and by first marking the different areas off from one another and then thinking through the extremely complex and mediated relationships that exist between these subdisciplines and subcomplexes, which are in themselves entirely dissimilar things. I would like to say, especially to those of you who are in the first semester or the first few semesters of the sociology course, and who naturally begin by thinking, so, we'd like to gain an overview of the scientific field as a whole in the same way a student of jurisprudence can expect. I am deliberately using this example, as jurisprudence, aside from the natural sciences, is the epitome of such a completely consistently structured, dogmatic theory. I would like to tell you from the start that you will not find any such thing in sociology. Rather, to the extent that there is a formation of theories, it assumes precisely a reflection on these discontinuities, and you should not believe that you can presuppose any implicit unity that would show you the way, as it were, through a field that is not only immense but also full of cracks. In telling you this, I am pointing out once again that the interpretation of social facts is closely connected to the facts themselves and their divergence, and necessarily changes with them. But I think it is necessary at this point to move on with our subject and to ask why the facts within society do not simply lend themselves to theory and to theory formation, of the same type as one finds in the natural sciences. So in other words, I think that reflection on the relationship of theory and fact in sociology, in the social sciences, requires a reflection on the role played by the so-called facts within society itself, and this role of the facts, the status of the facts within the complexion of a total society, is really the crux of the entire problem of sociological theory formation simply because, for a number of reasons, these facts are not merely identical to society itself. Because society is by no means limited to its own facts in the same way that jurisprudence rests on the findings which can be subsumed under the law, let alone the way in which facts correspond to the laws of natural science. In the first session after the Whitsun holiday, then, we will have to start by considering the status in society of the facts themselves, of the factual, and the consequent implications for our knowledge, which will simultaneously bring us closer in content to an idea of a theory of society. Notes of Lecture 31. June 2, 1964. In Ibsen's Hetty Gabler 2. There are two intellectuals who are rivals in their affections for Hedda. The one, Dr. Jurgen Tesman, her husband, holder of a government scholarship, is a practitioner of cultural history today, one would call it cultural anthropology, and the other, who loves Hedda, but does not marry her, Ejler Lovborg, is talented but